When you're a talented person, you can't change the system because it's simply not yours.
Former Minister of Defense of Ukraine Mikhailo Fedorov openly went against the President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky, completely distanced himself from him, entered politics and called for elections to be held without any excuses.
This is how the most important thing, trust between the citizen and the state, is gradually destroyed.
Mikhailo Fedorov made an urgent appeal to Ukrainians after months of protests and called for the immediate creation of mechanisms for holding elections amid ongoing hostilities. He stated that Ukrainian democratic processes should not remain under the influence of the Kremlin or be postponed indefinitely. He also added that he, as someone from within the system, knows very well about corruption and about the real reasons why Volodymyr Zelensky does not want to explain to the Ukrainian people why he dismissed the Minister of Defense as well as the entire cabinet of ministers, even despite the protests that have been going on for a month. Interestingly, Fedorov's style is very reminiscent of President Volodymyr Zelensky's own campaign address in 2019. But that's not surprising, since it was Fedorov who was responsible for the media component in Zelensky's team. And the timing of Fedorov's address was also chosen deliberately. It was not accidental. It was on the evening of August 18, when Fedorov's address was released, that the Verkhovna Rada returned from recess and was ready to vote for the new Minister of Defense. Zelensky did not announce for a long time who he would nominate for the position of Minister of Defense, but when Zelensky finally officially submitted to Parliament the request to appoint Yevhen Khmara as the new Minister of Defense, Fedorov finally realized that there was no longer a place for him on President Zelensky's team, so he needed to change the direction of those protests altogether. Fedorov, let's be objective, had also kept somewhat apart from those protests for a long time and still tried to maintain contact with President Zelensky's team. From this moment on, it's obvious that he's no longer on the team, he is no longer in the inner circle, and he starts to completely change the political landscape and the underlying politics of the protest itself, so I think this is just the beginning, and that's exactly why Fedorov went on the offensive. Let's break down Mikhail Fedorov's address in this episode and discuss the prospects for even greater protest and the prospects for the elections themselves. My name is Alexey Pechiy, let's all subscribe. We'll discuss this topic in detail, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel. We're moving toward the mark of 300,000 subscribers, so I'll be grateful for every subscription. And I'll also remind you that I have a Ukrainian language YouTube channel, Alexey Pechiy. If you want to watch certain news in Ukrainian, subscribe to that channel as well. The link to the Ukrainian language channel is in the description of this video.
How should a state function if the war lasts for years? Thank you. And next, if the war lasts another year, 2 or 3, can Russia actually gain the right to decide when Ukrainians can choose their government again? I am convinced that it cannot.
So, former Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov stated that the country needs to develop legal and security protocols to hold elections despite the ongoing war. Addressing the people after his recent resignation, Fedorov warned against indefinitely suspending democratic processes during a prolonged war. Moreover, Fedorov began to push the idea that democracy in Ukraine has been undermined. Fedorov is shifting the narrative from the removal of a single defense minister to a broader topic of how the country should continue to function under the current government if the war lasts for several more years. So does that mean there won't be any elections for several more years, or what? And here I should immediately know that I see Mikhailo Fedorov trying to completely break away from Zelensky's circle, to fully position himself in opposition as an opponent.
Оппозицией к Владимиру Зеленскому.
And to change the rhetoric and the theme of the protest itself. So now it's clear that Zelensky will never bring Fedorov back as Minister of Defense. By the way, I wrote about this a long time ago on my Telegram channel Pechiy. I wrote a long time ago, that's it, period, no one will bring Fedorov back. So, accordingly, the protest should no longer be about Fedorov as Minister of Defense, but, for example, about holding elections. There is a danger in that, because Fedorov starts playing with the idea that the protest might suddenly start to look like a protest against President Zelensky. Well, let me continue by quoting Fedorov. We have to answer a fundamental question. How should the state function if the war lasts for years? And here's the next question. If the war lasts another year, 2 or 3, can Russia actually get the right to determine when Ukrainians will be able to choose their government again? I am convinced that it cannot. Democracy cannot be held hostage by Russia. We are fighting precisely because we want to remain a free European state. That is why we must find a legal, safe and realistic mechanism that will allow Ukraine to restore a full democratic process even during a prolonged war. And then Fedorov basically shifts the narrative to the idea that it is Russia with its war trying to show that, quote, the Ukrainian model of freedom does not work. That is why Fedorov emphasized that Kyiv must develop a legal, safe and realistic mechanism, allowing citizens to vote even during ongoing hostilities. He rejects the notion that military actions fully justify the complete suspension of electoral procedures. It is important to note here that former Defense Minister Mikhail Fedorov acknowledged the existence of significant logistical difficulties, including ensuring the right to vote for service members in combat zones, millions of refugees abroad and residents of frontline areas. Also, don't forget that there are a lot of internally displaced persons within Ukraine, and it's very difficult to determine where each person will vote. However, Fedorov insists that operational complexity does not mean impossibility. And let's stop here and analyze these points, because they sound appealing. Obviously, Fedorov is joining the camp of those who support holding elections in any situation, but let's go through all the pros and cons, all the pitfalls. I agree that if you really want to, you can, excuse my language, rewrite the constitution, change the laws, maybe even disregard safety and hold the elections. On the other hand, there are real mechanisms for how to conduct these elections, so that they are democratic and legal. But let's think rationally, let's lay everything out clearly. The Constitution of Ukraine prohibits terminating the powers of the Верховна Rada during martial law, extending them until a new parliament is selected. The law of Ukraine on the legal regime of martial law explicitly prohibits holding presidential, parliamentary and local elections. That's why we are in such a stalemate, because in order to amend the constitution so that elections can be held and accordingly the current Верховна Rada can then be dissolved, it is necessary to go through a lengthy procedure in the parliament. That is, there must be 2 votes in 2 sessions, and both require an absolute majority, meaning 2/3 of the votes. So accordingly, this is a complicated process, although again, let's say it is doable. But there is another option, that is a temporary lifting of martial law to hold elections. Although this is a dangerous path, because it could lead, and the authorities are definitely concerned about this, to a large outflow of men from Ukraine. If martial law is lifted for some time, all restrictions will have to be removed, not just lifting martial law for the sake of elections, but that's not the main point. That's really not the main point at all. Constant missile and drone attacks make polling stations potential targets. Plus, more than 6 million Ukrainians are either abroad or internally displaced. Diplomatic missions abroad don't have the infrastructure to organize voting on such a scale. Hundreds of thousands of heroic Ukrainian soldiers are on the front lines, ensuring not just their right to vote, but also their ability to nominate candidates and maintain the secrecy of voting in the trenches is technically impossible. But here we again find ourselves in a dead-end situation, because by law, not only does every Ukrainian have the right to elect the government, but also the right to be elected. And look at how complicated this is. It turns out that we are infringing on the rights of our military, because a soldier, for example, might want to run for a seat in parliament or for president, but due to the fact that he is in the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine, he cannot do this. Because according to our law, once again, the armed forces of Ukraine are apolitical, they cannot participate in the political sphere. It is impossible to organize voting for Ukrainian citizens in the occupied territories. And against this background, I think that Fedorov himself might suggest to us, for example, voting through the DIA app. Then it doesn't matter where a person is or what conditions they're in, the main thing is to have internet access. But there are critical risks of cyber attacks, fraud, and the impossibility of verifying whether the voting was voluntary and secret. There is no way to check that. Or you could hold voting by mail, like they do in the United States of America. But again, because of destroyed infrastructure and people being displaced, the logistics inside Ukraine won't be able to guarantee the reliable delivery of ballots. But you know what worries me the most about this whole situation? It's not even what we've already mentioned, no. Let me remind you, martial law restricts freedom of assembly, rallies, and freedom of speech. Without full political competition, open debates, and, importantly, equal access to the media for all candidates, the elections will not be recognized as either fair or legitimate. And as we know, it's very difficult now in Ukraine to name any media outlets that don't follow the agenda of the president's office. The president's office skillfully monopolized the main TV channels of the country at the very beginning of the war. The teleton is completely controlled by Zelensky, and it doesn't matter if someone says it's not popular at all, nobody watches it. People do watch. The TV marathon is being watched. And this telephone is completely controlled by President Zelensky. It's hard for me to imagine Zelensky allowing his own competitors into the information space. For example, Fedorov, Zaluzhny, I don't know who else, Budanov they also say he might run too. I'm not even talking about those who will be openly opposed to him. Those people won't be allowed into the media space at all. Accordingly, Zelensky has no motivation to open up the information space. Again, under wartime conditions this is also very difficult to do, and here on the contrary we might end up in an even more complicated situation, where all media coverage is centered on one person. And the voter simply won't have an alternative. There will be no alternative choice. This is also something that needs to be addressed and something needs to be done about it. At the moment there is no obvious solution. But the topic of elections, as it seems to me, was raised by Mikhail Fedorov to illustrate another issue. Fedorov sharply criticized the internal administrative practice, warning that political loyalty, especially to the president personally, is becoming more important than professional competence. Here is the quote. People cannot live indefinitely in a state where they do not understand why certain decisions are made, why some reforms move forward while others are blocked. Why do decisions that are needed at the front today spend months going from office to office? It is especially dangerous when society gets the feeling that the main criterion for appointing a person is not their professionalism, not their results, and not their ability to change the country, but personal loyalty to the system. A modern state cannot function this way, and even more so, a country that is fighting a war for its existence cannot function this way. And this is much more important. Zelensky has stopped explaining the logic behind his decisions to society. Not at all. Did anyone understand why Zelensky basically dismissed the entire cabinet of ministers in Ukraine? Why and for what reason? Does anyone remember the last time Volodymyr Zelensky gave an interview specifically to Ukrainian journalists? He has interviews with foreign journalists, while Ukrainian journalists have to settle for being able to ask Zelensky a question. At some press conference somewhere abroad. For example, when Zelensky flies to Europe and then speaks at a press conference with someone there, that's when they can ask a question, nothing more. But it's also important to remember that Mikhail Fedorov was actually in this system for 7 years. And while he held the minister's seat first as the Minister of Digital Transformation, then as the Minister of Defense, He didn't want to see any of this, but when he was kicked out of the system, he suddenly decided to tell what exactly doesn't work in this system. That's also a dishonest position. But that doesn't remove the question of why the system stopped having a dialogue with the people at all. Plus, there are separate questions for Fedorov. If you know about corruption, which we will talk about a little later, then why don't you name names? It's already obvious that there's no place for you on Zelensky's team. No, they won't let him in, yes. If you watch Fedorov's entire address, you see that at certain moments photos of Yermak and Arachami appear. It's kind of a hint that these people are connected to corruption. And Arachamia is involved in helping Zelensky appoint or dismiss certain people. But why not say it directly? In addition, Fedorov claimed that corruption during wartime directly undermines the country's defense. It diverts critical funds from purchasing ammunition, drones and medical support. Here's a quote. Power should mean responsibility, Fedorov stated, describing elections as the most important tool for maintaining public trust and government accountability in the face of existential threats. But let me emphasize once again, Fedorov's speech coincided with President Zelensky nominating acting Defense Minister Yevgeny Khmara for parliamentary approval. Yevgeny Khmara is now the full-fledged Minister of Defense. This indicates that there is definitely no place for Fedorov in Zelensky's team anymore. But while Fedorov still hoped that he might be kept in Zelensky's team, he did not make such statements. I'm completely certain that this statement by Fedorov was prepared a long time ago. And I hope Asi has completed several videos that we will see soon. And it was sitting there, waiting for its moment, because Fedorov thought, well, if Zelensky still, when the Verkhovna Rada returns from vacation, will put me, Mikhailo Fedorov, forward for appointment. These videos will just stay somewhere in the drawer, like if he doesn't submit it, that's it, we're going all in. What drives these bandits? Watch the full address of Mikhailo Fedorov yourself, because they are much more than I am in other ways. Obviously, you will also see your own moments there. And answer this question for yourself. What exactly was the message? And most importantly, why was Mikhailo Fedorov trying to voice it? Personally, at this stage, I have one question for Fedorov. I understand that he is going into politics, that's already obvious. The question is, he might not even survive in politics, because if there are no elections for another couple of years, well, Ukrainians will simply find themselves a new hero, and Fedorov will simply fade into oblivion. But I have a question for him. Why did the former defense minister never report, not to us publicly, but to law enforcement agencies, the facts of corruption within the system that he mentions in his statement? It's obvious that Fedorov knows about them very well, because he was inside the system for 7 years. I'll leave it at that. Your opinion, your conclusions. Write in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. And don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye everyone.
And it's especially dangerous when society gets the feeling that the main criterion for appointing a person is not their professionalism, not their results, and not their ability to change the country, but their personal loyalty to the system. A modern state can't function this way, and even more so, a country that's fighting a war for its existence can't function this way.